So we're talking about Wolf Manor today, which is a horror film directed by Dominic Brunt, who is Paddy in Emmerdale. Look who's here, Chris, DJ Chris.
Hey.
I always never know whether to call you Chris de Buerre or by your real name, or is Chris de Buerre your real name?
I'm just going to keep you guessing on that one.
The intrigue, I love it. So welcome back to Boys and Film. My name is Phil. We are talking about this film today, which is I would say a low budget but well made horror film. I think it is streaming on most platforms now. It's kind of like a film within a film because it's about a horror shoot and it's a vampire. It's an old washed up actor who's played by James Fleet from Vicar of Dibley and Four Weddings and a Funeral. He plays the washed up actor who is obviously acting as a vampire, but there is a werewolf that's actually really there at the manor, outside the manor.
I quite enjoyed lots of elements of it, and for me it really reminded me in lots of ways of like Carry On Screaming and stuff like that. That kind of horror film. That's not really a horror film at all, but like a horror film with lots of silliness and kind of funny things in it. And for me, that really enhances the horror of it. There were lots of bits of it that I really reeled from because they were really kind of horrific. And I think that was just amped up by the fact that all the silliness was happening around it a lot of the time, because, you get lulled into this kind of sense of, oh, that's just really kind of slapstick, and then the next minute somebody's having their eyeballs gouged out or something, So it kind of really heightened that for me. But to be fair, it was more successful for me because of the silly stuff than it was as a horror film. Despite the fact that the silly stuff really amps up the horror, it was more successful for me sort of comedy-wise. There's some really, really funny bits in there. As usual, I don't want to do spoilers, but there's a bit, a sort of little ongoing theme about or a little bit in the middle about the prop man who discovers something and is convinced it's a prop and it isn't a prop, and it's just funny, it's just and it's horrific and really funny, and that's what's so clever about it. So I enjoyed that bit very much.
Yeah, me too. So James Fleet plays an actor. He plays an actor called Oliver Lawrence, who's a stage and screen actor who's been playing a vampire in a string of kind of Hammer horror movies. So he's there, obviously being filmed, and he's got a stand-in. I thought the stand-in was brilliant because the stand-in was almost like Danny Dyer with a dodgy blonde wig. It was obviously shorter than him, didn't look anything like him. It was a bit tubbier, and there was one scene where they were trying to do this kind of fall over scene where James Fleet's character had to fall over. I think he was being speared through the heart, wasn't he, with a stake through the heart, and you just see, it's almost like Airplane used to do. Do you remember Airplane, when a lot of the funny stuff kind of happened, not off screen exactly, but it wasn't the centre point. So you could see it in the distance, something funny happening. And it was kind of like that. And I think you could see that these filmmakers obviously loved those kind of films, the funny stuff. And I think horror and comedy doesn't always go well together, but I think they got this right, even though it didn't scare me. It didn't scare me at all, this film. But I don't know whether it was meant to. It
kind of horrified me in places because there's some gory bits, there's some nasty things, but as I say, they're nastier because of the kind of the comedic aspect of it. But just to talk about that kind of that actor's part, there's something really funny about that. It really reminds us of some of those. I mean, I can't remember her name, but the character Mrs. Overall in Acorn Antiques, where they do the episode where she's her actual true actress self, and she's got a turban on, and she's talking a posh accent and stuff, and she's a bit of a lush, and she's a bit dried up, and really reminded me of this main character. And actually, little associations like that just make it really funny. I mean, again, I don't want to spoil it, but this guy is doing it for the money. He's at the end of his career. He's obviously has done better things before this in his career, and he's ended up taking these kind of parts, and he's doing it because he has to, really, and because he's obsessed with the idea of fame, and he likes to drink, and there's some comedy with that, because he's sneaking off all the time to have little drinks, and it's affecting his performance, but everyone's too scared to tell him, and just silly stuff like that, just really bubbling away all the way through the film, and then somebody gets dismembered. As I say, that just kind of shocks you back into stuff. So it horrified me. I didn't jump. It wasn't scary. I didn't kind of, I wasn't kind of scared to go to bed that night. I mean, no more than usual, but but it was kind of horrific in places, and but with this kind of campy comedy. So that's who can say no to that.
James Fleet, I think, was definitely one of the best things about this film. I thought he did it, he did that comedy acting to a T. But I was going to say he should do comedy more often, but he has done, because I suppose he's well known for being in The Vicar of Dibley. And Four Weddings and a Funeral obviously is a comedy drama as well. But yeah, I just thought he was great. I thought he was really charming as well. And he did the facial expressions, the mannerisms and everything. It was just perfect. And I really liked his character. And I liked how his supporting cast responded to him as well. I thought the comic timing was really good. And also, it was well written, I thought. Joel Ferrari and Pete Wilde did a great script with this. I don't think the comedy always worked. I think there were a few moments where it was a bit stilted. And also, I think halfway into the movie, I think it did tonally shift. I said to you before we started recording that it's almost like it stopped being a comedy, and I quite like that campy, over the top, like you say, very carry on feel about it. It was almost like old school horror, because I know that the director, Dominic Brunt from Emmerdale, he's a big fan of horror movies, but he's a big fan of old school classic horror. Obviously, An American Werewolf in London gets a real nod here, because when it starts off, we've got those journalists that go into the pub. Is it the Blue Moon pub? I think it was called. I think so, yeah. And he did reference it. One of them said, "Oh, it might as well have been called the Slaughtered Lamb," obviously, which is an in-joke for people that know American Werewolf in London. So it had that feel about it, and also the feel of the cinematography. They got the lighting right. We see the mist on the moors kind of feel. It felt quite atmospheric.
I tend to agree with you that the tonal shift is really interesting, is it? Because you're being very diplomatic and call it a tonal shift. I'm going to say it actually slightly ran out of steam a little bit.
Yeah.
The kind of campy comedy just wore a bit thin. I think it just, that we'd already had quite a lot of the most obvious jokes that you could do. And there's a reason that Carry On films are only just over an hour long generally, because that's as long as you can stretch the joke. And I think, I'm going to say about 2/3 of the way through, it started to run out of steam a little bit, because the success of the comedy and the horror was just going a bit sort of towards the horror perhaps, and it was just kind of wearing a bit thin. But, it kind of entertained me. But I think pace-wise, I'm always a bit disappointed when the horror is revealed too early in the story. I'm not going to say it was too early in the story here, but there's a sort of explicitness about the reveal here, which wasn't quite as dramatic as it is in other films. There's more of a build-up sometimes to the horror, to the perpetrator, to the beast. And actually, it was a bit like he sort of, this isn't what happened, but it's a bit like he just opened the door and was stood there. I mean, that isn't how the reveal happened, but it was a bit inconsequential.
No, you're right, because there's no transformation, is there? Like, usually with a werewolf movie, like An American Werewolf in London, you see that transformation or the howling. But with this, it was very instant, wasn't it? You're right.
Yeah. Suddenly, the werewolf was just there, and you're like, oh, it's a werewolf. Okay, fine, there's a werewolf outside in the garden. And I'd like there to have been a bit more mystery about that. I'd like to have been kept guessing about that a bit more. And I think this other word that kind of came into my head afterwards, that was this kind of fairy tale thing. And I mean, obviously a pretty horrific fairy tale, but it's got a slightly fairy tale-y ending. It's kind of quite fantastic, quite fantasy in a way. And that's what starts to creep in for me about 2/3 of the way through, that it's got this kind of really kind of fairy tale nature, which is not that's a good thing to be doing in a horror film. But for me, it kind of coincided with the tonal shift from being comedic horror into a sort of fairy tale-y sort of horror thing, and it just kind of shifted slightly in terms of feel for me at that point.
I definitely agree with you on it feeling like it was running out of steam, because I think the way it was written as well, not just the mood of it, but the jokes weren't landing as much halfway in. And also an indication of that is that I was looking at my watch as well halfway in, and when that happens, the alarm bells start ringing, because I start to think, oh, am I bored with it now? But I wasn't bored, but I did think, oh, I wonder if it's gonna keep up the pace towards the end. Luckily it got that back, it got the energy back. But I quite like the confusion of the old man, the manor house setting with the vampire movie set, the kind of film within a film thing that I mentioned earlier. I quite like that, because it's almost a bit meta. which is quite a modern thing.
Postmodern, in fact. But, you know, I think what's really interesting is that whole, I mean, because you're getting the sort of sense of boredom on set and the kind of, oh, God, are we really making another cheap horror film kind of thing? You get kind of drawn into that, you know, in terms of the kind of writing and the production of it. And then suddenly the real stuff starts going down. And then, you know, that's obviously pretty scary and horrific. And, you know, that was a clever device, I thought. But, you know, you sat through more of this film tonight. And it's interesting that you said you were looking at your watch. But when the credits started rolling, I was like, okay, it's over. You, I think, got a bit more film than I did.
Yeah, there's a really long scene at the end after the credits involving Rula Lenska, the legendary actress Rula Lenska, who appears in a black and white scene. I mean, I don't want to say anything to spoil it, because obviously that's a bit of a golden nugget at the end for some people. I suppose it's like almost like a separate film in a way. But yeah, that was quite odd. It was almost a bit David Lynch-esque, shall I say.
Carry on, David Lynch, maybe.
A very odd way to end it, I thought. But yeah, it's quite a nice touch.
Yeah, well, for me, it ended way before that. So that wasn't the ending I got.
You missed that.
I'm kind of interested in this. Maybe there's a new genre out there that we could be thinking about here. You know, slapstick horror. You know, kind of silly, campy horror. You know, it's people have done it before. Let's be honest. But you know, there's something quite slapstick about this. You were talking about the scene where the guy's like doing this repeated falling over, this stunt. Yeah. And it's just silly. It's funny, you know, but kind of horrific as well. Because I was thinking, my God, this guy's going to be like bruised to hell. You know, keeps falling over. You know, but you know, I quite enjoy that kind of the clash of the kind of slapstick and the kind of truly horrific stuff. Because let's be honest, there's some pretty gross, horror-y type stuff in it as well. It's not, you know, people aren't just getting slapped around the face here. There's more sinister stuff going on.
Well, no, because I saw an interview with Dominic Brunt, the director, who said that he loves horror films, but he hates torture porn. So he doesn't like Hostel or any of the other films, you know, where they're really overly violent. But equally, he does like, or he does expect horror to be quite gory, you know, and that can, I suppose, be gore that is really schlocky as well. So it doesn't have to be necessarily like really violent, as in kind of just nasty, grisly horror. So that's quite refreshing.
It does give it some appeal, I think, in a broad way. I mean, I know that like true horror nuts are going to be probably a bit disappointed because it's not as gory as they might be used to, and obviously comedy fans are going to be maybe a bit repelled by the horror. So to be honest, the audience for this is quite an interesting, you know, demographically. I can see how the pitch went for this, you know, when they were talking about the film. You know, people saying, well, is it a comedy? Is it horror? And the people making the film saying, well, it's both. And there being slightly blank stares coming back across the boardroom table. I can imagine that being a tough sell. And, you know, I think actually they pull it off really well as a bit of both. But, you know, you and I watch an awful lot of films and we like comedies and we like horrors. But, you know, I wouldn't say I like comedy more than horror or vice versa. But people who do like one more than the other may not be that into this film. You know, it's got, in a theory, it's got broad appeal, but it might actually be quite niche as well, you know?
So the verdict then, what are you going to give it? We're going to go for a star rating. So what's your star rating for Wolf Manor?
I am going to say 2 stars out of 5.
And the reasons being?
It wasn't quite as cohesive as I wanted it to be, you know, and it just ran out of steam. And if it had managed to maintain some of that energy and comedy and that kind of true blend of kind of horror and comedy for longer, I'd have been happier about it, I think. But it just ran out of steam a bit for me.
I think there's a very fair point. I'm going to go for 3 stars. I'm going to be a little bit kinder because I did think it was well written. I did think it had pacing issues, like we mentioned earlier. You said about, you know, halfway in, it does drag a bit, and it does shift tonally. I don't mind tonal shifts, but I was kind of enjoying the really campy comedy style. So I was a bit disappointed that it did veer off a little bit. I thought it was a film that was well made, though. I did think it looked good. I've got to say credit to the cinematographer, who is Vince Knight. I think he's done a really good job of this. I think it looks good.
It was atmospheric, absolutely. And, you know, if one thing we know about horror is it's got to take you there. You know, you've got to feel scared. You've got to be in that environment. You've got to really, you know, empathise with the characters because of this kind of scary environment they're in. And you're right, you know, the cinematography and the art direction was very clever in that regard, because clearly not on Hollywood budgets, they managed to absolutely create those atmospheres. Totally
and I
agree.
think it does feel like a film that is made by someone who likes horror, and I think you can tell that. Obviously, not just because of the in-jokes, but it feels passionate. It feels genuine to me.
Absolutely. I think the people that made this film wanted to make a film they would sit down and watch too. The irony of that, of course, is that the film that's being made in the film is absolutely not a film that those filmmakers were in love with at all. They're doing it for the bucks, and I quite like that. That the film, the actors making the film in the film are definitely doing it for not the same reasons that the filmmakers who made the film were. I think that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah. So it's called Wolf Manor. It's out now on digital platforms. If you've seen it, or if you're liking, or if you're looking to see it, leave us a comment down below. All the details on the screen and in the description box. Obviously, if you've enjoyed this video, check out our review of Barbarian, which we loved, didn't we, Chris?
We totally love Barbarian.
So much so we saw it twice. Yeah.
We've both seen it twice now, and absolutely total winner. Loved it, yeah.
Good to see you, Chris, and thanks everybody for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.